Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 18th, 2022. What I want to report today is quite urgent. It's a reassessment that's come from Scott Ritter, who's an arms control expert and who's been one of the most accurate in his reporting on both the background to the Russian military operation in Ukraine and especially the dishonesty and the lies behind the U.S.-NATO side. Now, some are reporting with some dismay that Ritter has made a reassessment, as though he's shifted from Russia is winning to Russia is losing. It's given them, I think, a great deal of concern, but I think it's important that people actually listen to the interview that he did on May 14th with Ray McGovern and Garland Nixon, because what he is essentially presenting is what we've been saying for a long time, which is that if the U.S. and NATO are not stopped from the present course of moving toward a full-scale war against Russia, we will be in a nuclear World War III. And Ritter and McGovern on this are very clear and straightforward in their assessment. So let's begin with instead of reacting, I think people should listen to it and keep the following in mind. There are 2 points I want to make. First, that they have been pointing out that the billions of dollars of weapons that are being poured into Ukraine and logistical support, intelligence backup, and so on, is making a difference. That while Russia is succeeding in a way in its limited efforts of the special military operations, especially in the East and in the Donbass, the West is actually embarking on a full-scale proxy war against Russia, which was the intent expressed by Defense Secretary Austin at the recent meeting at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which is the clear statement that's coming from Stoltenberg of NATO, from Boris Johnson and others, that the intent is to win the war for Ukraine. Now, this is becoming even more urgent to address because one of Putin's demands in his December statement to Biden was that there be no eastern expansion of NATO, and this has just been violated again. With the decision to bring Finland and Sweden into NATO. And Finland has an 800-mile border with Russia. So clearly the promises that were made from the U.S., the fact that the U.S. didn't listen to Putin has become increasingly clear, and the U.S. drive for war is also increasingly clear. Now, the assessment shared by Ritter and McGovern, and I think this is accurate, is that the promises made by Biden in that December talk with Putin, that there would be no offensive weapons to Ukraine, were either lies by Biden or probably more likely overridden by the security intelligence apparatus, which has been preparing for a war with Russia over the last couple of decades. Now, their intent is to destroy Russia as a potential alternative to the unipolar order which was decreed at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this has been especially the case since Putin became the president and began to reverse the collapse of Russia. Ritter's assessment confirms what Helge Zepp-LaRouche has been saying. And what he said explicitly confirms what Helge is saying, that the U.S. military strategic posture is insane, that it's based on the idea that, if necessary, a nuclear war can be won, and that that's what's behind the buildup of the proxy war to push the Russians into a situation where they either back down in defeat or face a nuclear assault from the West. The idea of a tactical, limited nuclear war, which is explicit in the war game scenarios that the U.S. is carrying out. Now, this assessment, I'm saying that this policy of the West is driven by the speed at which the force behind the unipolar order, namely the so-called strength of the U.S. economy, is undergoing a remarkable deterioration. It's not just the inflation, the supply chain collapse, it's the collapse of physical production. It's the collapse of the ability to improve the productivity of the workforce, which is the only real source of wealth. Printing money is not wealth. Accumulating funds on bank balances based on appreciation of speculative assets is not wealth. It's monetary gain, but that can be wiped out in an instant. And that's what we're heading towards. And that's why there's a drive for the Great Reset and the Green New Deal to establish a global bankers' dictatorship, which will completely consolidate the unipolar order. And the push for war against Russia, using Ukraine as a military proxy, that's what is being done to prevent Russia from emerging, along with China and other nations, as a potential counter to the Great Reset of the bankers' dictatorship. This is why we urgently need a new strategic and financial architecture. And it's an agreement, it's a policy, the idea of a new architecture is supported by most people living in the world today. That is, the majority of nations, not the majority of nations, excuse me, the majority of people live in nations which are opposing the war against Russia. And this has been clear in UN votes. Countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, are the global south, so to speak, are moving against the United States' assertion of a unipolar order for the same reason they fought against colonialism, and why many of them were part of the non-aligned movement in the 50s and 60s, because they didn't want to be brought into a power block which would have put them on a course toward war. Now, the Schiller Institute is going to have a special video conference on May 26th, which will include Ray McGovern, along with Colonel Richard Black, General Leonardo Tricarico, the former Chief of Staff of the Italian Air Force, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, to discuss how we move to this new security and financial architecture and why this war has to end. We'll have the details on this. As soon as I get the final details, I'll post it at the bottom of the description page, but it will be May 26th at 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time. Now, on the economic financial insanity, let me just add something, because this is directly connected to the military drive behind the unipolar order. Blackrock just sent out a message under the headline, Prepping for a Financial Hurricane. Now, Blackrock is the world's largest asset manager. It manages $10 trillion in assets. And it was very much at the center of the push for the Great Reset, going back to the August 2019 conference in Wyoming, where they laid out this whole idea. Now, what they say in this memo is that a Category 5 hurricane equivalent is about to strike. This was released on May 17th under the title, quote, Polishing Your Surfboard When There's a Financial Hurricane Outside, unquote. Now, they state that this is underway and that this financial hurricane can cause, quote, devastating monetary losses, unquote, possibly even comparable to the Great Depression or the 2008 global financial crisis. But then they essentially say, fear not, for there's a bright side, that they can offer, quote, opportunities that should arise once the tempest has calmed, unquote. Their advice, quote, find a safe place for this hurricane to pass, unquote, then prepare to move as, quote, some spectacular returns could follow in its wake, unquote. Now, what are those spectacular returns? Well, they're obviously connected to the investments in the Green New Deal, the proposal from Blackrock that goes back to 2019, that there could be a $40 trillion to $60 trillion bonanza from the Green New Deal, and that a compact made between major bankers and central banks enforced by governments would ensure the flow of funds into this pool, a 40 trillion plus pool, that would be available to those who invest appropriately in Green New Deal policies. This is why we're seeing the fight in the world today. Most countries do not want to to give up on their sovereignty, to submit to the power of a central banker dictatorship, which says you cannot invest in fossil fuels, you cannot invest in efficient energy sources such as nuclear, fossil fuel, coal, and so on. But you must go with the green policy, and that credit will be withheld from any country that does not accept this. This is the underlying issue that we're seeing fought out right now in Ukraine, because the Russians and the Chinese refuse to submit to the demands that they give up their sovereignty. So as a result, you have the combination of the utopian insanity of the war planners who believe they can win a limited nuclear war to ensure the success of the Great Reset of the global financial and corporate interests. That's what we're fighting. And stay with us. Keep joining us every single day for updates on this. I'll be doing a webcast with Mrs. LaRouche tomorrow to discuss this further. So keep watching this site for updates on what you need to know to make sure we defeat this globalist policy. Thanks, and I'll see you tomorrow.